Some prayers are answered quietly, not with blessings that appear, but with people who slowly disappear. And that moment can feel confusing, even painful, because the person leaving might not seem like an enemy. They might be someone you trusted, someone you loved, someone who once felt like part of your future. Yet there are seasons when God begins removing certain relationships from a person's life, not as punishment, but as protection and preparation. The difficulty is that most people misunderstand what is happening while it unfolds. They try to repair what God is closing. They chase conversations God is ending. They reopen doors that heaven has already started shutting. And the deeper problem is this: when God begins removing someone from your life, the process rarely looks dramatic at first. It looks gradual. Conversations change. Trust weakens. The sense of alignment you once felt begins slipping away. What once felt natural now feels forced. And somewhere deep inside, a quiet question begins forming. Why does this relationship suddenly feel different? One of the first signs that God may be removing someone from your life is the sudden exposure of patterns you once ignored. For a long time, the relationship may have seemed stable. Familiar routines formed. Conversations followed predictable rhythms. But then something shifts. Behaviors that once felt small begin revealing deeper patterns. Words that once sounded harmless now expose attitudes you had not fully noticed before. It is as if the light has grown brighter, making things visible that once remained hidden. This does not always mean the other person has suddenly changed. Sometimes the change is happening within you. When God begins preparing someone for a new season, He often sharpens their awareness. Things that once seemed acceptable begin feeling heavy. Conversations that once felt normal now carry tension. The reason is not simply emotional sensitivity, it is spiritual clarity. God begins showing you what your heart previously overlooked. And that clarity can feel uncomfortable because it forces a question many people avoid. Is this relationship helping me grow closer to God, or quietly pulling me away from the direction He is leading me? Sometimes the answer to that question becomes clearer through small moments rather than dramatic events. You notice that conversations with this person often leave you drained rather than strengthened. You realize that certain habits appear when you are around them that disappear when they are not present. You recognize that your values begin bending slightly in order to keep peace or maintain approval. These small shifts accumulate over time until a deeper awareness begins forming. The relationship is no longer neutral. It is shaping the direction of your life. And God often reveals that influence long before He removes the person entirely. If something in these words feels familiar to you, pause for a moment and acknowledge it honestly before God. Sometimes recognition is the first step toward understanding what He is doing in a relationship that once felt stable but now feels uncertain. Another sign that God may be removing someone from your life is the increasing resistance you encounter when you try to maintain the connection. At first, you might believe the tension is temporary. Every relationship experiences seasons of difficulty. Misunderstandings happen. Communication sometimes breaks down. But when God begins closing a door, the effort required to keep it open often becomes exhausting. Conversations that once flowed easily begin turning into arguments or silence. Plans that once came together naturally begin falling apart repeatedly. Attempts to rebuild trust or restore harmony seem to stall in ways you cannot fully explain. Many people interpret this resistance as a signal to try harder. They invest more energy into fixing the relationship. They search for the right words, the right moment, the right solution that might restore what once existed. But sometimes the resistance is not coming from misunderstanding. Sometimes it is the quiet sign that God is redirecting both lives in different directions. When that happens, forcing the relationship to continue often produces more frustration than healing. because the effort is no longer aligned with the direction God is guiding your life. This is one of the most difficult moments to recognize spiritually. Human instinct tells us to preserve relationships at almost any cost. Loyalty, history, and emotional connection all push us toward repair. Yet Scripture repeatedly shows that God sometimes separates people in order to protect the future He is preparing for them. The separation may feel confusing in the moment, but later it reveals a deeper purpose that could not unfold while the relationship remained unchanged. And this leads to another sign many people overlook: when God begins removing someone from their life. The shift in your inner peace. At first, the relationship may have brought comfort, familiarity, even joy. But as time passes, a subtle tension begins appearing. Whenever you think about the connection, you cannot always explain it logically. The person may not have done anything obviously wrong, yet something inside you feels unsettled in their presence. That tension often appears as quiet hesitation when making plans with them, or a sense of relief when circumstances create distance. This does not mean every uncomfortable relationship is meant to end. Growth sometimes requires working through conflict and misunderstanding, but there are moments when the absence of peace becomes a signal that God is gently redirecting your path. Peace is one of the ways God confirms alignment with His direction. When that peace consistently disappears within a relationship, it may be revealing that the connection no longer belongs in the season God is leading you toward. And that realization often leads to one of the hardest decisions a person faces: the willingness to release someone they once believed would remain part of their life forever. Yet what feels like loss in the present moment sometimes becomes protection in the future, because God sees the paths people are walking long before those paths fully unfold. And when He begins removing someone from your life, it is rarely random. It is usually the beginning of a transition you cannot yet fully see. Most people assume that when God removes someone from their life, it will happen suddenly, like a door slamming shut without warning. But the truth is usually more unsettling than that. God often begins the process quietly, long before the separation becomes obvious. The relationship may still exist on the surface, yet something deeper has already begun shifting. The conversations are still happening, the messages still appear, the routines still continue, but the sense of alignment that once held everything together starts weakening in ways that are difficult to ignore. And this leads to the second sign that God may be removing someone from your life right now. The values that once seemed shared begin revealing serious differences. In the early stages of a relationship, those differences are often easy to overlook. People focus on what they have in common. They emphasize the parts that feel comfortable and familiar. But when God begins leading someone into a new season of growth, the priorities of the heart often change. What once felt acceptable begins feeling heavy. What once seemed harmless begins raising quiet concern. You start noticing the direction of the other person's life more clearly than before. The way they speak about others, the way they respond to pressure, the choices they justify when no one is watching. At first, these things might appear small, but over time they form a pattern that becomes harder to dismiss. You begin realizing that the paths you are walking are no longer moving in the same direction, and the deeper the awareness becomes, the harder it is to pretend that nothing has changed. This moment often creates an internal conflict many believers struggle to admit. On one hand, there is loyalty. You remember the history you share with this person. You remember the moments of support, the laughter, the experiences that once created a deep bond. Walking away from that history feels almost like betrayal. But on the other hand, there is conviction. Something inside you begins recognizing that continuing the relationship exactly as it has been, may no longer be healthy for your spiritual life. This tension between loyalty and conviction is where many people become stuck. They delay decisions. They ignore what their heart is sensing. They hope the differences will somehow disappear with time. Yet when God begins separating two paths, pretending the difference does not exist only prolongs the discomfort. And this is where another sign begins appearing. The conversations that once brought clarity now create confusion. Communication may still happen regularly, but instead of strengthening your direction in life, it begins clouding it. Advice that once seemed helpful now feels misaligned with what you believe God is leading you toward. Encouragement that once motivated you now feels strangely discouraging. You notice that after spending time with this person, your sense of purpose becomes less clear rather than stronger, and this confusion does not appear because the other person necessarily intends harm. Often they are simply living according to a different set of priorities. The problem is not always the character of the person. The problem is the direction of the influence. Every close relationship carries influence whether we recognize it or not. The words people speak, the attitudes they express, the way they interpret situations all shape how we think and respond to life. When God begins guiding someone into a new season, He often becomes very protective of that influence. He knows that the direction of a person's life can be strengthened or weakened by the voices they allow closest to them. And when those voices begin pulling the heart away from the path God is establishing, distance often becomes necessary. Recognizing this is rarely easy. Human instinct tells us to maintain harmony even when something feels wrong. People fear that acknowledging the change might lead to confrontation or emotional pain, so they remain silent. They continue the relationship while quietly ignoring the growing tension inside their spirit. But silence does not resolve the misalignment. It simply delays the moment when the truth becomes impossible to ignore. If you have ever experienced a relationship where conversations that once strengthened your faith now seem to weaken your clarity, pause for a moment and consider what God may be revealing through that shift. Sometimes the most loving thing God can do for someone's future is remove influences that once felt comfortable but no longer align with the direction He is preparing for them. And if this message is speaking to something you are currently experiencing, write the word clarity in the comments below as a simple way of acknowledging that God may be helping you see a relationship in a new light. Recognition does not always make the decision easier, but it often marks the beginning of wisdom. Because the moment someone begins seeing relationships through the lens of spiritual direction rather than emotional history, they also begin understanding why certain connections start fading at the exact moment their life begins changing. There is another moment that often reveals when God is removing someone from your life, and it usually appears long before the relationship officially ends. At first it feels confusing, almost like a shift you cannot fully explain. You still care about the person, you still respect the history you share, yet the conversations that once brought life into your spirit now leave a strange heaviness behind. You walk away from time spent with them feeling unsettled instead of strengthened. And the deeper truth many people struggle to admit is that not every relationship is meant to grow with every season of your life. Some people are part of a chapter, not the entire story. And when God begins writing a new chapter, the connections that belong to the previous one often begin fading naturally. This leads to the third sign that God may be removing someone from your life right now. The relationship begins draining your spiritual energy instead of strengthening it. At the beginning of a healthy connection, there is usually mutual encouragement. You feel understood. You feel supported. The presence of the other person brings clarity rather than confusion. But when a relationship starts pulling you away from the direction God is leading you toward, the emotional atmosphere begins changing slowly. Conversations revolve around negativity more than hope. Complaints replace gratitude. Cynicism begins shaping the tone of discussions. You notice that the time you spend together leaves you mentally exhausted rather than spiritually renewed. At first, you might assume the tension is temporary. Everyone goes through difficult seasons, and loyalty often requires standing beside someone during those moments. But over time, a pattern begins forming. Instead of lifting each other toward growth, the relationship begins reinforcing habits that weaken your focus on God. Small compromises appear more frequently. Priorities shift subtly. Spiritual disciplines that once felt natural begin slipping away without you noticing. This kind of influence rarely arrives with obvious warnings. It develops through repeated exposure. The human heart absorbs the atmosphere it spends the most time in. When someone consistently surrounds themselves with voices that minimize faith, question conviction, or treat spiritual commitment as unnecessary, those attitudes eventually begin shaping their own thinking. And God understands how powerful that influence can become over time. That is why Scripture often emphasizes the importance of guarding the relationships that shape your life most deeply, not because God wants people isolated from others, but because He knows that the direction of your heart is strongly influenced by the company you keep. One of the ways you can recognize this shift is by paying attention to how your inner peace responds after spending time with someone. Peace is not simply the absence of conflict. It is the quiet assurance that your life is moving in alignment with God's direction. When peace consistently disappears in the presence of a certain relationship, it is worth asking an honest question. Is this connection helping me become the person God is shaping me to be? Or is it slowly pulling me away from that path? Many people avoid asking that question because they fear what the answer might require. Ending or distancing from a relationship often feels like failure. It feels like giving up on someone you once promised would always remain part of your life. But sometimes the most difficult truth to accept is that loyalty cannot replace alignment with God's direction. When the path God is leading you toward begins separating from the path another person has chosen, forcing the relationship to remain unchanged often creates deeper damage than letting it fade naturally. This is where many believers experience guilt. They worry that stepping back from someone means abandoning them or judging their life unfairly. Yet God does not call people to remain in every relationship forever. There are moments when distance becomes necessary for spiritual protection and growth. That distance does not always mean hatred or rejection. Sometimes it simply means acknowledging that the season which once held two lives together has reached its natural conclusion. If you have ever noticed that certain relationships consistently leave you feeling spiritually drained rather than strengthened, pause and reflect on what God may be revealing through that pattern. Awareness is often the first step toward understanding why certain connections begin fading when your life starts moving in a new direction. And if this realization is speaking directly to something you have been sensing in your own life, write the word strength in the comments as a reminder that God sometimes removes influences not to punish you, but to protect the growth He is developing within you. Because when God begins preparing someone for a new season, He often removes the voices that once felt familiar but can no longer support the future He is leading them toward. There is one final sign that often confirms what the other signs have been quietly pointing toward all along. It is the moment when the distance you once feared begins bringing an unexpected sense of peace. At first, this feeling can be confusing, even unsettling. For a long time, you may have believed that losing this person would feel devastating, like a permanent wound in your life. But when the separation finally begins unfolding, something surprising happens. Instead of chaos inside your heart, there is a quiet calm you cannot easily explain. The pressure you once felt around the relationship disappears. The constant effort to maintain harmony fades. Conversations that used to feel complicated are replaced by silence that strangely feels restful rather than empty. This leads to the fourth sign that God may be removing someone from your life right now. The relationship begins closing naturally without the dramatic conflict you once expected. Many people assume that when a relationship ends, it must involve betrayal, anger, or some explosive argument that makes the separation obvious. But when God removes someone from your life, the process is often much quieter. The connection simply begins losing its momentum. Messages become less frequent. Plans stop forming naturally. Opportunities to spend time together begin fading without deliberate intention. At first, you might try to revive the connection. You send another message. You suggest meeting again. You search for ways to restore the rhythm that once existed. Yet each attempt feels strangely forced, as if the relationship now requires effort that once came effortlessly. Over time, you begin realizing something important. The distance is not growing because one of you suddenly stopped caring. It is growing because your lives are no longer meant to move forward in the same direction, and the peace that slowly replaces the tension becomes a quiet confirmation that God is guiding the separation for a reason you may not yet fully understand. This is often the moment when people look back and begin seeing things they previously overlooked. They recognize conversations that reveal deeper differences long before the separation began. They remember moments when their conscience quietly warned them that the relationship was influencing their direction more than they realized. They recall times when prayer felt difficult because something inside them knew the connection no longer aligned with the future God was preparing. What once looked like random tension now appears as a series of signals pointing toward the same conclusion. God had already begun redirecting their life long before the relationship officially ended. Understanding this does not always remove the sadness that accompanies distance. Even relationships that are not meant to continue can still carry meaningful memories. Gratitude for what once existed often remains long after the connection fades. But sadness and peace can exist together. You can appreciate what a relationship once meant while still recognizing that the season for it has ended. And that realization allows you to release the connection without bitterness or regret. One of the most difficult truths about spiritual growth is that God sometimes removes people from our lives in order to create space for something new. Not always a new relationship immediately, but often a new direction, a new clarity, a new depth in the way we walk with Him. Certain influences belong to earlier chapters of our lives. They shape who we become in those seasons, but they are not meant to accompany us into the next one. When God begins preparing someone for a different calling, He often removes the relationships that would keep them anchored to the past. That removal may feel painful at first because humans naturally cling to what feels familiar. But over time, many people look back and realize that the separation protected them from paths that would have quietly weakened their faith, their purpose, or their peace. If you are currently experiencing a relationship that seems to be fading despite your efforts to preserve it, take a moment and consider what God may be doing beneath the surface of that change. Sometimes the door closing in front of you is not a loss, but a form of guidance. And if this message has helped you understand a relationship in your life more clearly, write the word release in the comments as a simple way of acknowledging that you are trusting God with the connections He chooses to keep and the ones He gently removes. Because the truth is that God never removes someone from your life without also preparing the next step of your journey. Even when you cannot yet see what that step will be, His guidance is already shaping the path ahead. Sometimes the most confusing part of watching someone slowly disappear from your life is that nothing dramatic seems to happen. There is no single moment where everything clearly breaks. No obvious betrayal, no final argument that explains the distance. Instead, it feels like a gradual shift in gravity. The relationship that once felt effortless begins requiring effort. The connection that once felt alive begins feeling heavy. And deep down, you begin sensing that something larger than circumstance may be unfolding behind the scenes. What many people do not realize is that when God begins removing someone from your life, He often does it in stages. The separation does not happen all at once, because the heart needs time to recognize what is changing. If the distance arrived suddenly, most people would spend their energy trying to rebuild the connection immediately. But when it unfolds slowly, the awareness grows naturally. You begin noticing patterns. You begin understanding the influence certain relationships have been carrying over your life. And that awareness prepares you for the next step God is leading you toward. One of the clearest signs that this process is happening is the change in how you respond internally to the relationship. There may have been a time when this person's opinion carried enormous weight in your life. Their approval mattered. Their disagreement affected your mood. Their presence shaped the direction of your decisions. But as God begins shifting the relationship, something subtle starts changing inside you. The emotional hold they once had begins weakening. Their words no longer shape your thinking the same way. Their reactions no longer determine your peace. At first, this can feel strange, almost like emotional distance appearing without explanation. But often it is not distance created by indifference. It is freedom created by God, quietly repositioning your heart. When certain relationships remain too central in someone's life, they can begin shaping identity in ways that God never intended. Approval from that person becomes the standard that guides decisions. Fear of disappointing them influences choices that should be directed by conviction instead. Over time, this creates a situation where a person's spiritual direction becomes intertwined with the expectations of another human being. And when God begins restoring the proper order in someone's life, He often loosens those emotional dependencies first. The person who once felt essential begins occupying a smaller space in the heart. The attachment fades not through anger or conflict, but through clarity. Another sign that God may be removing someone from your life appears when opportunities to reconnect keep dissolving in unexpected ways. You try to meet, but plans fall apart repeatedly. Conversations begin, but never seem to deepen the way they once did. Messages that once flowed easily now feel delayed or incomplete. Many people interpret these moments as simple coincidence, but sometimes they form a pattern that becomes difficult to ignore. The connection keeps slipping through your hands no matter how carefully you try to restore it. When this happens, people often react by trying harder. They reach out more often. They search for explanations that might repair the distance. Yet the harder they try to force the connection back into its previous form, the more resistance they encounter. It feels almost as if the relationship itself is losing the energy that once sustained it. And that is often exactly what is happening. God is removing the momentum that once kept the two lives closely tied together. Without that momentum, the relationship cannot continue the way it once did. And while this process can feel painful, it often prevents something far more damaging from happening in the future. Because not every relationship that begins well is meant to last through every season of life. Some connections fulfill their purpose for a certain chapter and then naturally come to an end when that chapter closes. Trying to hold on to them indefinitely can sometimes delay the growth God is preparing for both people involved. If you look back over your life, you may already recognize relationships that once felt permanent but eventually faded in ways that made sense only years later. At the time, the separation may have felt confusing or even unfair. But with distance, you could see that the direction of your life would have been very different if the connection had remained exactly the same. God often protects the future by rearranging the relationships that surround us, and while those changes may feel uncertain in the present moment, they frequently reveal their wisdom over time. If you are currently experiencing a relationship that seems to be slipping away despite your efforts to keep it stable, pause for a moment and consider what God may be shaping through that change. Sometimes what feels like loss is actually the beginning of alignment, with a path that could not fully open while the relationship remained unchanged. And if these words resonate with something happening in your life right now, write the word trust in the comments as a reminder that God's guidance often becomes clearer when we release the connections He is gently moving out of our path. Because every relationship that leaves creates space for the direction God is leading you toward next. There is another moment that often appears when God begins removing someone from your life, and it is one that many people misunderstand at first. It is the moment when you begin remembering who you were before the relationship started shaping your life so strongly. For a long time, the connection may have influenced your routines, your thinking, even the way you interpreted situations around you. Certain habits formed because of the time you spent together. Certain compromises appeared because maintaining harmony felt easier than creating tension. But when the distance begins growing, something unexpected starts happening inside you. The version of yourself that once felt quiet or hidden begins returning. You notice that your thoughts feel clearer. Your priorities begin aligning more naturally with your faith again. The small inner conflicts that once followed certain conversations begin disappearing. At first, this change can feel subtle, almost like a shift in atmosphere rather than a dramatic transformation. Yet the more time passes, the more noticeable it becomes. And that shift often reveals something important about why the relationship is fading. God is restoring clarity to areas of your life that had slowly become clouded. This leads to another powerful sign that someone may be leaving your life for a reason connected to God's guidance. Your spiritual focus becomes stronger when the distance grows. There was a time when certain discussions with this person made you question convictions you once felt confident about. Maybe they dismissed the importance of your faith. Maybe they encouraged decisions that slowly pulled you away from the direction you believed God was leading you toward. None of it happened suddenly. The influence built gradually through repeated conversations and shared experiences. But once the distance begins forming, you realize how much easier it is to hear God's direction again. The noise that once surrounded your decisions becomes quieter. Prayer becomes clearer. Scripture begins speaking to your heart in ways that feel direct rather than confusing. Many people are surprised by this moment because they assumed the relationship was neutral. They believed it was simply part of life, not something affecting their spiritual direction. Yet once the influence fades, the difference becomes impossible to ignore. The path ahead feels simpler. The choices that once felt complicated suddenly seem obvious. And the peace that returns to your heart confirms something you may have sensed long before the separation began. God was protecting your direction by changing the relationships around you. Another sign appears when the relationship that once dominated your attention begins losing its emotional weight. You may remember a time when the thought of losing this person felt unbearable. The idea of life moving forward without them created fear or sadness that seemed overwhelming. But as the distance grows, that emotional intensity begins softening. You still care about the person. You still appreciate the history you share. Yet the feeling that you cannot move forward without them slowly disappears. This change is not coldness. It is clarity. The heart begins understanding that the relationship was important for a season, but not essential for the future God is preparing. When God begins removing someone from your life, He often replaces emotional dependence with spiritual stability. Instead of relying on that person for direction, encouragement, or identity, you begin discovering those things more deeply in your relationship with Him. This process may feel unfamiliar at first because it requires letting go of patterns that once felt secure, but it also reveals something powerful about the way God leads people through change. He rarely removes something meaningful without strengthening the foundation that will support you after it is gone. Another moment that confirms this shift is when you stop trying to chase the relationship back into its previous form. For a while, you may have hoped the distance was temporary. You may have searched for ways to restore the connection exactly as it once existed, but eventually a realization begins forming quietly in your heart. The relationship that existed before is not meant to return the same way. Not because the memories were meaningless, and not because the other person suddenly became your enemy. It simply means the season that held the connection together has reached its natural conclusion. Accepting this truth does not require bitterness or resentment. It only requires honesty. And honesty often brings a surprising kind of peace, because once you stop forcing the relationship to remain unchanged, the tension that surrounded it begins disappearing. You no longer feel responsible for holding something together that God has already begun separating. If you have ever experienced a relationship where distance slowly brought clarity rather than confusion, you understand how powerful that moment can be. It is the moment when you realize that what once felt like loss may actually be guidance. And if this reflection speaks to something unfolding in your own life right now, write the word forward in the comments as a quiet declaration that you are ready to walk into the direction God is opening rather than holding on to what He is gently closing. Because when God removes someone from your life, He is not leaving a void behind. He is making room for the path you were always meant to walk. There is another stage in this process that many people overlook because it does not feel dramatic enough to notice at first. After the tension, after the confusion, after the attempts to repair what once felt natural, something quieter begins forming inside the heart. The urgency to fix the relationship slowly disappears. The constant thinking about what went wrong fades, and the person who once occupied so much emotional space in your life gradually becomes less central to your thoughts. This change can feel surprising because there was a time when the idea of distance felt impossible to accept. You may have believed that losing this connection would leave a permanent emptiness. Yet when God is truly removing someone from your life, He often replaces that fear with something different. A calm awareness that the chapter is closing exactly when it is meant to. This is another sign many people recognize only after it begins happening. The relationship stops defining your emotional world. At one time, their reactions influenced your mood. Their opinions shaped how you viewed certain situations. Their presence affected the decisions you made about your future. But as the separation continues, that influence weakens. Their words no longer carry the same weight. Their absence no longer creates the same anxiety. Instead of constantly thinking about what they might say or how they might respond, you begin focusing more clearly on the direction your life is moving toward. This shift often feels like emotional space opening up inside you. The mental energy once spent maintaining the relationship becomes available again. And with that space comes something many people had not realized they were missing: peace. The quiet sense that your life is no longer revolving around maintaining something that was slowly losing alignment with your purpose. This peace is often the strongest confirmation that God is guiding the separation. Because when a relationship ends through anger or betrayal, the emotional aftermath usually feels chaotic. But when God removes someone for the sake of your growth, the distance often brings clarity instead of confusion. You begin seeing the relationship more honestly than before. You remember the moments that revealed deeper differences. You recognize the ways your path had already begun moving in another direction long before the separation became visible. And slowly the story of the relationship begins making sense in a way it never did while you were still trying to hold it together. Another sign appears when gratitude begins replacing frustration. Earlier in the process, you may have felt hurt, confused, even disappointed about how the relationship was changing. You may have wondered why something that once felt meaningful was fading, but as time passes, those emotions often soften into appreciation. You start recognizing what the relationship gave you during the season when it was part of your life. Perhaps it taught you something important about trust, about boundaries, about the direction you truly want your future to follow. Perhaps it revealed strengths in your character that you had not noticed before. When gratitude begins appearing where frustration once existed, it usually means the heart has accepted the transition. You no longer feel the need to rewrite the past or fight against the present. Instead, you acknowledge that the relationship fulfilled its purpose during a specific chapter of your story. And with that recognition comes freedom. Freedom to remember the good moments without needing the connection to continue exactly as it once did. Freedom to move forward without carrying resentment or regret. One of the most important truths to remember during this process is that God rarely removes someone from your life simply to create emptiness. He does it to create alignment. Alignment with the path He is leading you toward. Alignment with the growth that needs space to unfold. Alignment with the people who will walk beside you in the next chapter of your journey. And those people often cannot enter your life, while certain relationships from the past still occupy the space meant for them. If you have ever looked back at a relationship that once felt essential and realized that your life unfolded more clearly after it faded, then you understand the wisdom behind this process. What once felt confusing eventually reveals its purpose. The distance that once felt painful becomes the turning point that allowed your life to move in the direction it was meant to go. And if this message has helped you recognize something happening in your own life right now, write the word peace in the comments as a reminder that sometimes God removes certain people not to harm you, but to guide you toward the future He has already prepared ahead of you. Because every relationship that ends under God's guidance is not simply an ending. It is often the quiet beginning of the next part of your story. There is one final truth about this process that many people only understand after enough time has passed to see the full picture. When God removes someone from your life, the purpose is almost never only about that person. The deeper purpose is about you, about where your life is going, about who you are becoming, about the direction God is shaping for your future. At the moment the distance begins, most people focus only on the loss. They wonder what they could have done differently. They replay conversations in their mind. They question whether the relationship might have survived if one more effort had been made to fix it. But as time moves forward, something becomes clearer. The relationship did not fade because you failed to hold it together strongly enough. It faded because the path God was preparing for you could not unfold the same way if the connection remained unchanged. Many people eventually look back at the relationships that once felt permanent and realize something surprising. The version of themselves they are becoming today could not fully exist inside the life they were living back then. The priorities have changed. The values have deepened. The clarity about what truly matters has grown stronger, and the people who once felt essential to the earlier chapter no longer fit naturally into the direction the story has taken. That realization does not erase the meaning those relationships once carried. Every connection that enters your life shapes you in some way. Some relationships teach joy, others teach wisdom, some reveal the kind of person you want to become, others reveal the kind of influence you must eventually leave behind. But none of them are random. Even the ones that end unexpectedly often prepare your heart for the direction God is guiding you toward next. One of the clearest signs that a relationship was removed for a reason connected to God's guidance appears much later. It is the moment when you see the path your life has taken since the separation happened, the clarity that returned, the opportunities that opened, the peace that replaced the tension you once felt. Every time the relationship pulled you in conflicting directions. At the time, you may not have recognized what God was doing, but looking back, the timing begins making sense. The separation happened exactly when your life was about to move into a new chapter that required a different environment, different influences, and sometimes different people walking beside you. This perspective often changes how you view the entire story. What once felt like rejection begins looking more like redirection. What once felt like loss begins revealing itself as protection. God was not removing someone to leave you alone. He was clearing the path so you could move forward without the weight of something that no longer belonged to your future. And once that understanding settles into the heart, something powerful happens. The need for explanation disappears. You stop asking why the relationship ended the way it did. You stop searching for reasons that might justify the distance. Instead, you begin trusting that God sees the parts of your story you cannot see yet, the roads you have not walked, the decisions you have not made, the people you have not met. He knows which connections will strengthen the life He is building in you, and which ones would quietly pull you away from it. If you are currently watching someone slowly fade from your life, and you cannot fully understand why, remember this. Sometimes the absence of clarity is temporary. The understanding often arrives later, when enough time has passed for the next chapter of your life to begin unfolding. And when that chapter opens, you may realize that the relationship you once tried so hard to keep was never meant to accompany you into the future God was preparing. If this message has helped you see your situation from a different perspective, write the word faith in the comments as a reminder that trusting God with the relationships in your life requires courage, but it also opens the door to the direction He has already prepared ahead of you. Because the truth is that God never removes someone from your life without also guiding you towards something that belongs more deeply to the path you are meant to walk.